Investigation into abuses, but it has yet to pull members together to issue an official statement on the situation, a marked contrast to what happened with Libya. Well, joining me now is the Conservative MP Rory Stewart, who's a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and in Jerusalem we can speak to Hillel Neuer, who is Executive Director of United Nations Watch. Mr. Neuer, if I could start with you, perhaps. What is the United Nations doing about this? They were remarkably quick to act on Libya. Syria, I imagine, is posing a bit more of a problem.
That's right. Gaddafi was sort of a one-off. Everyone hated Gaddafi in the Middle East and around the world, so it was a special moment. But Syria, the UN has waited. The crackdown has been lasting for a month. Funeral mourners are being shot. People are being shot inside mosques. Youths protesting for freedom are being killed. And the UN, until now, has relatively expressed only muted criticism. So the Human Rights Council meeting on Friday will really be the first session, and it's far from clear what will result. The majority typically supports dictators and abusers of human rights. So it's really far from clear what result we'll get from that meeting.
I mean, what you're talking about is the possibility that a Syrian representative is actually elected to the Human Rights Committee.
Well, that's right. It's not the first time that this has happened. Bear in mind that China, Saudi Arabia, Cuba are members of the Human Rights Council. They are in the dominant faction that decides results in the Council. Libya was elected last year. Syria declared its candidacy a few months ago. They were officially endorsed by the Asian Group, which is the largest bloc at the United Nations. Not a single country or UN official spoke out. If not for what's happening now with tanks being sent in to fire shells against their own civilians, I don't know if we'd even have this session. So what UN Watch and other human rights groups are calling for is that at this session on Friday, not only should Syria's violations be condemned, an investigation be launched, but also the Human Rights Council should declare clearly and loudly that Syria is not a qualified candidate to be a member on the world's premier human rights body. In fact, it's offensive and morally outrageous and indeed absurd.
OK, stay with us, Mr. Neuer. I want to bring in Rory Stewart. I mean, I think what we're hearing there at the United Nations, you would presumably see as vindication of what you've been saying all along since this Jasmine Spring started, that it's more complicated than we tend to think.
It's very complicated, but Syria's clearly crossed the line. What's happening there is shocking. And the last few years we've been trying to do a sort of normalisation of our relations with Syria. People have been friendly, there have been a lot of visits. That's all finished now. The last 4 weeks has ended that, and we're now going to move to a much, much more attitude towards them as a pariah state.
But is that it, just to simply declaring that this is a state that we can't...
Yeah, but it makes quite a lot of difference. I mean, this is a regime where the First Lady grew up in Ealing. There's a lot of money, they like shopping in Paris, and the first thing we need to do is we need to name and shame the leadership and stop them from taking those fancy trips. And as we found in Zimbabwe, those kind of things do have an impact. And it'll be a real shock for Syria. They've been very used to people being nice to them over the last 5 years.
But do you see any chance, based on what Mr. Neuer is saying, that the United Nations is going to be able to amalgamate? Because, I mean, Syria is much more part of the Arab family, in a sense, than Libya ever has.
I think we're going to be able to get there. I hope we're going to be able to get there. The Arab League is already beginning to condemn Syria. It's actually quite exciting in some ways. You're beginning to see more movement, maybe, than he acknowledges. And if we can see movement against Syria, that's a very positive sign.
As far as the ongoing military operation in Libya is concerned, I mean, obviously no question that that would ever be expanded into Syria, presumably.
Absolutely not. We neither have the support, we don't have the support from the Arab League or the coalition, and we probably don't have the capacity to do that. So what we'd be looking at is much firmer, much more targeted sanctions, not against the people but the regime.
I have to say, there is an element of I told you so, because I remember when the younger Assad took over and people talked about him, as you say, having a wife who grew up in this country, having spent a lot of time in this country himself. Tony Blair rushed to Damascus to stand next to him and was promptly very loudly denounced for Western policies towards Israel in particular. So, I mean, you know, we have tolerated the Assads for a very long time.
That's true. I think people have been playing a game. He's been on a tightrope with Iran on the one side and on the other side the West. And the West's been trying to pull him over to our side, and clearly that hasn't worked, as she's shown over the last 4 weeks with his tanks. So I think that whole period is now over, and we now have to treat him as an enemy.
Mr. Neuer, you happen to be speaking to us from Israel. I wonder how you would assess the mood in Israel, because there's perhaps a sense that the tectonic plates are shifting around Israel in a way which no one yet has managed to get a handle on.
Yes, I think the mood is concerned, cautious, and I think that Israeli leaders will probably take the most prudent and cautious steps given the risks. Bear in mind that although many of the liberals, we welcome them taking over in Egypt, it hasn't happened yet, but there are candidates emerging. Many of them are expressing hostility toward Israel. So while Israelis, I think, want there to be neighbors who are democratic, or at least are in that direction, rather than repressive regimes that ruled Syria and Egypt and the other countries, there is a concern that some of the Democrats who've been lobbying, who've been campaigning, have tried to appeal to some of the baser prejudices of their population. But I think that Israelis will definitely welcome having societies that are concerned about the welfare of their own population, that are not looking to look for scapegoats. And Syria is a regime that we can't say we didn't know about Syria. Look, this is a country that in 1982 killed more than 10,000 civilians in the city of Hama. It's a country that sponsors terrorism abroad. It's a country that's a police state. For many years now, whenever there were rare protests of a dozen people in Damascus asking for freedom, they were immediately sent to jail and tortured. And you know, Syrian dissidents living abroad have told us this. So I think the international community, including the United Nations Human Rights Council, turned a blind eye. We never had a resolution on Syria and the victims of human rights violations ever. And indeed, if not for the events of the recent weeks, Syria would most likely be elected to the Human Rights Council and is still today a candidate. That's still something that our human rights coalition from around the world has to fight. We shouldn't have to fight this. The United Nations leading officials, the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, should long ago have brought Bashar al-Assad to the ICC for war crimes.
Thank you. It is a question of should. And Rory Stewart, I mean, this is a fact, isn't it, that our whole view of the Arab world is going to have to change, because in many ways we in the West have actually been quite comfortable with some of these authoritarian
You're absolutely right.
regimes.
It's changing very dramatically, very quickly. We don't understand the Arab world as well as we should. It's unbelievably complicated, and we need to get on the progressive side, because that's the direction it's moving in. And we need to get away from playing around with regimes like Syria.
You obviously have followed Afghanistan and continue to follow Afghanistan very closely. What do you make of the nomination of General Petraeus to be the new head of the CIA?
It's extraordinary, and actually quite worrying, because it means that the lines between civilian and military in the States are being even further more blurred by Obama. So I think that's probably a retrograde step.
Not something you'd welcome?
No, I think we would like a world in which civilian and military people were kept distinct, not merged together.
Rory Stewart, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to Mr. Neuer in Jerusalem.